Let's talk about camera bodies. You know, there's always the next best camera set to come out just a few months down the line. In this video, we're going to help you sort all of that out so that you can focus on the features that are important to you in selecting a digital camera body. So we're talking about camera bodies, which means just the body and not the lens of the camera, which means that we're talking about interchangeable lens camera systems here. And one thing that we can use to separate and sort out the vast number of cameras that are out there is sensor size. There's three main sizes of cameras that you will see. Now there's more sizes than three, but most of the cameras that you'll see out there will fall into three different sensor sizes. You have micro four thirds, APS-C, and full frame. Now, what are the differences between these? Well, full frame is kind of the standard, and full frame is the digital equivalent of 35mm film. APS-C and micro four thirds are both smaller sensors compared to a full frame sensor. If you're looking at smaller than full frame sensor cameras, you'll probably hear the word crop factor used to describe the imager. Now, what does this mean? You can think of it like this. If we imagine a lens on a full frame camera, and this is not, but we're just going to imagine for a second, the lens takes the light that's in front of the lens and it focuses it, and in the back of the lens, it projects an image circle onto the camera's sensor. Now, on a full frame camera, the image circle covers the entire full frame sensor. Now, if you put that same lens on a crop sensor camera, the effect is that we take the image and we crop in on it because the lens is still projecting the same size circle. We're just seeing a smaller portion in the center of it. The effect is that if you were to put a 50mm lens on a full frame camera, you would get a certain composition of your image. If you take that same lens and you put it on something like a micro four thirds camera, that has a 2x crop factor, so it will not look the same. In fact, it sort of looks like the same composition you would get as if you would have put a 100mm lens on your full frame camera. Now, it's not exactly the same field of view, but it's kind of generally the image magnification difference between a crop sensor and a full frame. So you get that kind of cropped in effect. Now, there's a few considerations that you need to make when you're selecting the size sensor. One of them is what things will look like. One of the effects that you get when you're using a camera with a smaller than full frame sensor is that your images won't be as wide compared to a full frame sensor because we're essentially taking the lenses and we're cropping in on them. And anytime you crop in, it gets tighter, not wider. So it's a little bit more difficult to get wide images on a smaller sized sensor. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't get wide shots on a crop sensor camera, but something like a fisheye lens that has a super wide field of view will look much different on an APS-C sized sensor than it will on a full frame sensor or a micro four thirds sensor. All of them have a different kind of crop factor. The other thing that may make a difference is noise and light sensitivity. If you take two sensors that have the same number of pixels, say we have a full frame sensor that's 10 megapixels and we have a micro four thirds sensor that has 10 megapixels. The full frame sensor will be more sensitive to light because the photoreceptors on the full frame sensor will be larger. And because they're larger, more light will hit them compared to the micro four thirds sensor because it has smaller photoreceptors because we're cramming in more megapixels in a smaller area, less light will hit those photoreceptors. And so it'll be less sensitive to light. The effect of this is that to get the same exposure or the same sensitivity on a smaller sized sensor, you have to turn up the image gain. And when you turn up the image gain, the image gets noisier. Now, on modern cameras, this isn't the hugest deal because noise levels are better today than they have been in any point in history. And noise levels are actually pretty good, but there will definitely be a difference. On full frame sensors, you can really crank up the ISO and the noise is not really that bad. But on smaller sensors, as you start to crank up that ISO or image gain, the noise does start to get out of hand. So that's definitely something to consider. Another thing to consider is mirror or mirrorless cameras. Now, DSLRs have mirrors in them. When you look through the optical viewfinder, you're looking through a series of mirrors and you're looking directly through the lens. You're not looking at a screen, you're looking through the lens. This is the same as kind of looking through binoculars or a telescope. You're looking through the optic. On a mirrorless camera, when you look through the viewfinder, you're looking at a screen, and the screen is displaying what the sensor is seeing. So there is some physical differences in the camera, but it extends beyond what you see when you stick your eye in the viewfinder. For one, DSLRs are more complex. Because they have that mirror, they have a whole bunch of things in them that makes the build of a DSLR much more complex. You have to have motors, you have to have bearings, and all kinds of extra stuff in here because it has that mirror, where mirrorless cameras are less complex. Another thing to consider about a DSLR is that it's usually rated in a number of shutter cycles, and the mirror plays into that. Because the mirror sits right in front of the sensor, every time you take a picture, that mirror flips up out of the way and exposes the sensor and the first and second curtain. And there's only so many times that your camera can handle flipping up and down the mirror before it just won't, it'll break. Modern cameras are rated in the hundreds of thousands or 150,000 or maybe even 200,000, so it's quite a lot. But a mirrorless camera doesn't have any of that mechanical stuff inside it. Because DSLRs have a mirror, they're also potentially going to be slower at the maximum number of frames per second they can shoot. Because on a DSLR, every time it takes a picture, it has to flip that mirror up, where a mirrorless camera doesn't have to do that. Now, frames per second may not be a huge deal for you, and we're not talking about video, we're talking about stills, but it may be something to consider depending on your shooting style. So size and weight is another thing to consider when you're looking at camera bodies with mirrors and camera bodies that are mirrorless. When you take the mirror out of a DSLR, which is essentially what a mirrorless camera is, you can get it a lot smaller. So they have mirrorless cameras that are almost the size of compact cameras. This also means that it weighs less too. Now, DSLRs don't weigh a ton, but without all of that extra mechanic stuff in there, you can really shrink it down and you can get the weight down too. And that can be a big difference to you, because if you think about it, you can get a camera that has this same exact sensor in it in a tiny little form factor. So you get the same image quality in something that's much, much smaller, and that may be appealing to you. Now, when you do go smaller, you lose some stuff too, and usually you lose buttons and convenience and speed of operation. You see, with all of this real estate here on a DSLR camera, they can put things like knobs and buttons and dials on them. I mean, look at the back here. I got all kinds of things. And so I can change exposure and shutter speed and ISO and flash exposure and white balance all very quickly because I have, a bunch of buttons here. I have buttons along the top. But if we take this and we shrink it way down, we still need a big screen because, camera makers sell cameras based on the size screen that they have for whatever reason. But you do need a screen on the back to see what in the heck you're doing, because you can't look through the lens on a mirrorless camera. And when you shrink that down, you don't have the space for all these buttons and dials and knobs and extra screens and things like that. It's not the end of the world, but it is something to consider for sure. Now, it used to be that mirrorless cameras were nice and cute and fun and neat, but they were nowhere near as good as DSLRs. But in the last year, there have been some serious heavy hitters that have come to the mirrorless market, and things that are just as good as almost any DSLR out there. Now, DSLRs probably have the lock on accessories, camera accessories like batteries and cases, grips and straps and things of that nature. And certainly they probably have more lens attachments too, but Canon and Nikon both make mirrorless that work with the same mount that they have of their DSLRs. So some makers, you still have a tremendous amount of options, but when you go to some other makers like Panasonic, Sony, and Olympus, you may have less lens options. Now, on some of those, you can get lens adapters to use, but those adapters are expensive and they may not work with all the lenses. So it may not work with your autofocus system or your image stabilization system on one of your lenses. It's another thing to throw into the mix of considering what camera body you get. With all of that said, there's not really a bad camera out there that's been released in the last year or so. Almost all of the cameras are better than the previous generation of cameras, so you can't really go too wrong. DSLRs are not going anywhere anytime soon, so if you're interested in a DSLR, don't be afraid, even though mirrorless cameras are smaller and they take pictures that are just as good and they're lighter and they may be more mechanically reliable. DSLRs have been made for a long time, so it's not like you're going to buy it and it's going to break right away. They're going to last for a really long time if you get a nice one. All the manufacturers will make kind of a pro line and then a prosumer line and then a consumer line of cameras, even in DSLRs. And even the ones that are marketed towards consumers that are, they kind of feel real plasticky are still excellent cameras. They come with a ton of features. My sister just bought the kind of cheapest, I think, Canon DSLR, and that still has a ton of features. It can control flash wirelessly, which is something that when this camera came out, it was like a big deal. So decide on the features that are important to you, talk to your photographer friends, and buy it from a camera retailer that has a good returns policy. Something that you can buy it, maybe check it out for a few days, and if you hate it, you can send it back and buy another one. Now that you know some things to consider in camera bodies, you're ready to move on to the next lesson, where we're going to cover options in lenses.